every Ukrainian family has stories that kind of link up into all of these different pathways for Ukrainian identity, however contested it might be. And I think, being able to provide an accounting of all of that in all of its complexity, which is really what my book attempts to do, I hope will allow readers to kind of understand just how complicated what happened during World War II, what happened in Ukraine, how complicated the Soviet Union was, and, with that greater understanding could therefore be less susceptible to some of the propaganda, particularly coming out of the Kremlin, that all Ukrainians are Nazis or whatever. Obviously, that's not true, but there's some history there. There's a reason that idea has gotten some traction, and that's also important to talk about.
I'm Tyler McBrien, managing editor of Lawfare, and this is the Lawfare podcast, June 2nd, 2023. It's often said that Russia is a country with an unpredictable past. Such distortions of history, though, can lead to trouble, as the world witnessed last year when Vladimir Putin justified his invasion of Ukraine as an attempt to denazify the neighboring country, one with a Jewish president who lost relatives in the Holocaust. As Megan Buskey writes in her new memoir, Ukraine is Not Dead Yet, a family story of exile and return, quote, "How could a country know itself unless it knew all the things it had been?" I sat down with Megan, a nonfiction writer and former Fulbright Fellow to Ukraine, who has studied and written about the country for 2 decades. We discussed her book, the use and abuse of history in Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and the role of family histories in countering those false narratives. We also talked about the best way to get a Polish archive to give you the documents you need. It's the Lawfare podcast, June 2nd. Ukraine is Not Dead Yet. Megan, your new book is called Ukraine is Not Dead Yet, a family story of exile and return, but it actually starts with quite contemporary topics. The book opens with the Omicron variant of February 2022, and then shortly after that, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Putin's armies. But then the book quickly goes back into your childhood and in your own family history. So I'm curious if you could just set up the book for the readers. What story and stories are you trying to tell with this new book?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. The book was really initially formulated as a story about the life of my grandmother, my Ukrainian grandmother, Anna. I grew up in the United States, but very close to my grandmother, who had emigrated from the Soviet Union in the 1960s. She had settled in Cleveland when she emigrated to the United States with my mother and one of her other daughters. It was because of her that I was able to was exposed to a lot of Ukrainian cultural traditions. I went to Ukrainian church growing up, and I became very interested in my heritage and started going back to Ukraine when I was in college. Started meeting my relatives that my family had left behind when they came to the United States. And but it was really only in the past 10 years, my grandmother died about 10 years ago, that I really committed to this project. And it initially was started as just sort of an attempt to document everything that I knew about her life. And it's sort of ballooned into something that was bigger than that. It became an exploration of the circumstances, more broadly speaking, that she experienced, what some of the experiences of her contemporaries were throughout the 20th century in Ukraine. And I think also starts to get into some bigger questions about Ukrainian history, public memory culture in Ukraine, and how sort of Ukraine's difficult 20th century should be remembered.
Yeah, and I definitely want to jump into those bigger questions very soon. But first, I wanted to say personally, as someone who's close with their own grandmother, I found many passages, especially in the beginning, quite relatable. You mentioned that, from an early age, you did have a strong interest in your Ukrainian background and your grandmother's life. But initially, perhaps it wasn't so, and something changed and you did develop a deeper interest. So I'm curious, what changed in your adolescence to spark that interest? And then if you could talk about how long this book has been in the making and, where the idea came from. I think someone just glancing at the title and the release date might think perhaps that it was written, solely after the invasion and focused on sort of the fallout and the aftermath there. But as you tell it, it sounds like it's been a long time in the making.
So the shift for me, as I mentioned, grew up in the Ukrainian diaspora, grew up going to Ukrainian church and kind of being subjected to various Ukrainian customs and cuisine and traditions, whether I liked it or not. And I think, as an American kid growing up in the suburbs, I didn't want to go to, a church on Sunday morning and, stand and listen to this sort of ancient liturgy that I didn't understand. I didn't want to eat copious amounts of sauerkraut and kielbasa and stuff like that, which is what my grandmother always seemed to be offering us. So I think as a kid, I had I just wanted to kind of hang out and play Nintendo. But as I got older and sort of my grandmother's experience became sort of more clear to me, I think there were things even as a child that I observed about her that puzzled me, that she was extremely frugal, that she was incredibly hardworking, and also that she had this sort of very difficult early life that sometimes she would talk about and she would break down. And she was the only person in my life who I ever saw cry, who I ever knew had lost, she lost her brother tragically fairly early in World War II. And I was curious about those things as a kid. And I think as I kind of got into adolescence, sort of my fuller appreciation of who she was as a person led me to have just sort of more questions about her and what this place was that my family had left. And all of those things were sort of what propelled me into going to Ukraine and starting to unravel this very long story. In terms of how long I have been working on this, deliberately and intentionally, it's been, I would say, since my grandmother died about 10 years ago, I started to really try to put this together in some kind of form. And initially wasn't necessarily thinking about it as a publishable book. But as I, gathered more and more material and started to see these linkages across my family's experience and how it sort of spoke to, I think, a kind of quintessential Ukrainian experience during World War II, I started to feel like it would have more value for the public. But I ended up, I did copious amounts of research for this book. I went to Ukraine, I don't know, innumerable times to do interviews with people. And I spent a lot of time doing research in archives to get materials pertaining to my family. I did a lot of reading of scholarship on 20th century Ukrainian history, people like Timothy Snyder, John Paul Himka, Jan Gross, Jared McBride. All of these people were people that were so important to really shaping my understanding of that time period. And so it took a long time to put it all together. And it was definitely, I actually finished the first draft right before the full-scale invasion started. It's like, oh my gosh, do I have to redo this book? But I think I was able to sort of put a frame on it that would help people understand, that there is relevance between the past, the recent history and kind of what's unfolding now in the region.
Yeah, and before we get too far away from this sort of methods discussion, I wanted to make sure to touch on the piece of advice that you got when you were in the Polish archive to sort of, I guess, entice or to better elicit a response. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I was working with, I had to submit an art. My family was from Ukraine, what is now Ukraine, but documents about Ukraine are sort of scattered all over Eastern and Central Europe. And so I was doing a request to a Polish archive, and I was working with an archivist or a librarian at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC, who was super helpful to me throughout all of my research. And he was, informed me that as you structure this, the records request, that you kind of want to pull out the heartstrings of whoever might be, be reading the records request. And so we put in some language about, sort of referring to, the fact that my family had been repressed under the Soviets, and then also put it all in all caps. So it would make it seem like it was coming from someone who wasn't very technologically savvy, and therefore somebody would maybe have a little bit more empathy for them. And it worked. So it was good advice, I guess.
Yeah, when I read that passage that you said that it makes you seem less savvy and more pitiable, I thought about trying it out with my own colleagues to see to get some empathy from them. But no, I think one thing that really drew me to the story, especially initially, was the secrecy that surrounded your family story and this sort of unspokenness. Mm-hmm. And you write yourself that, and I'm quoting here from your book, "It was precisely the story's murkiness that made me feel that it contained something worth knowing." So I'm curious, what were some of the more difficult things you found, and why do you think it was initially so murky to you and sort of unspoken about?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really important and fascinating question. And I think there's a political dimension to it, which is really important to understand, which is that, history under the Soviet Union was very manipulated at the political level, at the institutional level, but also kind of as a result, that had a lot of consequences too in terms of what people shared, personally within their own families. So, during the Soviet Union, there were so large swaths of things that were taboo to speak about. So, the Holocaust, Stalin era purges, Ukrainian nationalism, etc. All of those things were various times throughout the Soviet Union. You just couldn't speak about them without fear of some kind of repercussion. And so obviously that created a lot of blank spaces in people's understanding of the history of their country and their time and their recent history. But it also informed, what people were willing to share. And I heard over and over again from people that I spoke to that their parents did not tell them what had happened during World War II because of fears of repercussions that their children might face for knowing that information, for knowing, for example, that a grandfather had served under the Nazi administration, or that somebody had had a brother that was in UPA or something like that. And people were very reluctant to share that information with people outside like their closest confidants. And so I think it's incredibly important. That's one of the reasons that there is so much silence, I think, around certain aspects of Ukrainian history. And I think there's another reason too, which is that, World War II was horribly traumatic in Ukraine, in, a lot of parts of Eastern Europe, but Ukraine, strongly, very, very traumatic. And I think it was very difficult for people to talk about some of the most horrible things that they had seen. And I think that that's a more kind of universal phenomenon. But both of those factors, I think, created a lot of silence within families about what had happened during World War II. And I think there's also people just needed to survive. I think that was also in large part what influenced in my own family the silence was that my grandmother, who ended up getting deported to Siberia because her brother had been a member of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, had been working in coal mines at the order of the Soviet state, spent about 20 years doing that, and faced often very difficult conditions for herself and her family. And I think she, as a result of that, was just so focused on like what needed to happen in order for her to survive, in order for her children to be secure. That was at the top of her list of things to think about. And then I think to the extent too that like, when there was a couple of times when we started to get into some more difficult material, things that had happened during World War II. I remember I was talking to her at a car wash in Cleveland, and we somehow got onto the topic of the war, and she started telling me about how she would have been maybe 17, 18 at this time, how she had gone with some of her peers to retrieve the bodies of some of her friends who had been killed by Soviet forces because they kind of kept the bodies, away from the community, but they were able to like retrieve the bodies so that they could be buried by their families. And I remember she just started to like break down as she was talking about that. And I think there was a sense for her, it was very difficult to kind of manage discussion of those things with the sort of overwhelming pain that remembering those things often brought up. So there's a lot of different factors, I think, that go into, at least in my case, my family's sort of reluctance to talk about the past. But I think there's and that's true in terms of your question about like, what did I find? And, I found a lot of different kinds of things that I was, not really, I think there were things that I didn't, it was sort of clear that I didn't quite know. Like one of the things the stories that I tell in the book is the story of finding and meeting my own grandfather, who I didn't know or hear anything about growing up. I just knew that he had been left behind in the Soviet Union. My grandparents had divorced, and that was it had been a very acrimonious relationship, and that tie was cut. And I ended up, when I started going back to Ukraine, finding him and developing a relationship with him, which was also quite complicated because obviously there was a reason that my my grandmother decided to cut off a relationship with him. I also found out about the terms of her first marriage that preceded her marriage to my grandfather, which was also, I think, a very complicated and difficult one, which involved, her, possibly being, I don't know, forced into a sexual relationship with a much older man, only for him to then be arrested by the Nazis and sent to Auschwitz and later dying at a different concentration camp. And then the other thing that I look at in great depth in the book is the life of my grandmother's brother, Stefan, who was someone that she loved very, very dearly. And I think was probably the man she loved most in her life. And he had died very young at the age of 23, just after the war ended. And I discovered that he had been in the Ukrainian Auxiliary Police under the Nazis, and then also in the Ukrainian Insurgent Army's security service, which was a not good thing to be involved in, which was kind of going around and kind of vanquishing anyone that they believed wasn't supporting the Ukrainian nationalist cause, including civilians, women, and children. So obviously that was a very difficult discovery, unfortunately not uncommon in that region by any stretch of the imagination. I go into a lot of depth trying to understand, why the Ukrainian nationalist movement was so powerful in that region at that time, why it really spoke to people who had traditionally been poor, oppressed, and sort of without the means to enact the futures that they wanted to see for themselves, and how, the Ukrainian nationalist movement ended up being able to appeal to people like Stefan, who had so much promise and so much to give. He was sort of seen as a leader in his community, but how like those gifts were sort of twisted into, service in these terrible, terrible entities.
Yeah, I think one thing that your book does so well is to show how this silence and perhaps failure to come to terms with the past, just among families, sort of serves as a microcosm for those same dynamics at play on the national level and then often at the international level. So I'm curious what you think the repercussions of silences like these have today in terms of maybe the use or an abuse of history, not to load up the question too much. Mm-hmm. And then what role you see family histories like yours playing in either adding to or countering these narratives.
I think there's another important contextual element to be sure to include whenever you're talking about Ukrainian history and Ukrainian public memory, particularly in World War II. And it relates to the conditions that I was setting up before, which is that, this is a really kind of a recent set of ideas and histories that people are grappling with. I mean, Ukraine's only been independent for 30 years. And, there was sort of an explosion of revelations and public information that really just became available when Ukraine became independent. And also in the 90s, and certainly in the aughts as well, I think there were a lot of, with the fall of the Soviet Union, society had to be restructured at every single level. And so this idea that history was kind of lower on the list of priorities, I think. And it's really only been within, I would say, the past 10 years that there's been an appreciable number of people that are, there certainly were starting in the 90s, but it's really been in the past 10 years that there's been some momentum that's been developed around kind of critically examining Ukraine's history. So I think it's really important just for people to know that this work is still maturing, it's still evolving, it's just kind of getting its bearings, I would say now. But I do think work, like this, my book is very helpful because I think it, and I really hope, one of the things that I think is important to stress is that my family's story is like by no means extraordinary, that every Ukrainian family has stories that kind of link up into all of these different pathways for, for Ukrainian identity, however contested it might be. And I think, being able to provide an accounting of all of that in all of its complexity, which is really what my book attempts to do, I hope will allow readers to kind of understand just how complicated what happened during World War II, what happened in Ukraine, how complicated the Soviet Union was. And, with that greater understanding could therefore be less susceptible to some of the propaganda, particularly coming out of the Kremlin, that all Ukrainians are Nazis or whatever. Obviously, that's not not true, but there's some history there. There's a reason that idea has gotten some traction, and that's also important to talk about and discuss too.
Yeah, your book does a great job of tearing down at least the idea of a sort of monolithic or centralized narrative of Ukrainian history, especially in the 20th century. And so I do see it as a sort of corrective. And I'm really curious of your experience, especially over the past year and a half, of your own sort of identity and family history and country of your forebears being thrust into the spotlight on the international stage, seeing misconceptions really aired out or corrected. So what has that been like to really, I guess, sort of the traumas of the war aside, but just the idea of Ukraine now, having so much visibility?
On one hand, I think it's wonderful. Have been so heartened by the compassion that people around the world have demonstrated to Ukraine in the face of this horrible war. I think I was, I guess, somewhat surprised by that, but obviously, again, just very heartened by it. One thing that I'm as a writer, I'm also really trying to do as much as I can as to really help people understand Ukraine as an independent country, as a place that has its own rich history, culture, politics, etc. now. And I think, as much as we can define Ukraine and create a lasting understanding of what it is, the better for Ukraine in the long run. And this is a country that has so much to offer, that's so rich and so intriguing. And I guess I hope that as this war continues, that people use their curiosity about Ukraine to not just learn about it as a place of war, but also learn about it as a place that offers much more than that.
One thing you write in your book that really stuck with me is, quote, "How could a country know itself unless it knew all the things it had been?" So I'm curious, with that line in mind, when, if ever, the past should stay past, were there any things maybe that you learned that you wish you hadn't known? Or was this sort of difficult process of uncovering the truth a completely necessary one in which you sort of have to go all in with?
Yeah, I'm emphatically on the side of, knowing as much as one can. And I think, one place where I think it's kind of hard to have conversations about this right now because of the war, but there is this legacy and the celebration of the Ukrainian nationalist movement, and particularly Stepan Bandera, who is the leader of the Ukrainian nationalist movement during World War II, or the most radical element of it, which has become what has been popular in Ukraine for a while, but in the face of this war has kind of become even more significant. I think for understandable reasons, but at the same time, knowing the history of his ideas and knowing, the track record of the nationalists, which is very complicated, but also I think very dark, and that's important to talk about. I hope that I mean, we're not in the place where we're doing like a post-war reconstruction, but I hope that Ukraine will be able to define itself. That that people like Bandera were sort of held up as sort of the founding fathers of Ukraine by some segments of the Ukrainian population. But what's happening now is such a kind of more moving and sort of fair and powerful, I think, sort of founding myth. And as we look to this notion of who are the heroes in Ukrainian history, I mean, there's so many people that have thousands and thousands of people who have stepped up for their country over the past year and a half in this way that is so incredibly moving, and I think will provide such a wonderful guiding light for Ukraine moving forward. And I hope that that will mean that Ukrainian society and will be able to let go of some of these figures and some of these historical movements that have, I think, a checkered history and at various points espouse principles that are in opposition to what Ukraine is fighting for now.
As you mentioned at the beginning, you grew up in Cleveland. One thing that I was curious about reading the book was your experience sort of at the intersection of your American and Ukrainian identities. How do they sort of play on one another? And especially now in sort of viewing the war from the United States, assuming you're based here, your sort of intersectional identity as a Ukrainian American, how that's informed your view of the war and your family history.
Yeah, that's a good question. I am based in the US. I think it's sort of, at least my experience of the war has been kind of like one of dual consciousness a bit, in the sense that I'm sort of living my normal life here in the US, but I'm also following the war very closely. I'm tracking every day's developments via, a lot of digital means. And there's a way in which I actually feel very emotionally present there too. I think even just that kind of distant emotional presence is very powerful and very difficult, in the sense of, seeing what's happening there on a daily basis is something I think that is important for me to do as a Ukrainian American, but also something that's like, I don't feel that distant from. And I don't know how that will change as the war continues. But I think even just especially over the past month with these attacks on Kyiv, where I lived for some time, it's been very difficult to see that happening. That's my immediate reaction to the question.
Yeah, no, the idea of a dual consciousness is really interesting. As we near the end here, I would love to hear about the reception you've gotten from your book since it's been released, either among the Ukrainian diaspora here and around the world, Ukrainians still in Ukraine experiencing the war, or even non-Ukrainians. Has anything surprised you from people reading the book?
Yeah, I've been very touched. I've gotten a number of, letters from people. I was quite nervous about the reception of the book, because it takes kind of, as I mentioned, like a fairly critical stance towards some aspects of Ukrainian history, which is somewhat controversial. And I was expecting to get a lot of criticism for that. And I have gotten some. That was really what I was expecting. But I've also gotten a number of letters from people who are particularly of Ukrainian descent here in North America, who have thanked me for the work and have said that they see it as like a blueprint for their own investigation into their family stories, that they've had similar questions about what their family's pasts were. And there was a real receptivity for a very complex take on this history, which I have found just to be very, very moving and powerful.
Something I always like to do before we wrap up is to just open up the space to you if there's anything that you wish I had asked or anything that you wanted to add.
Oh, one thing I really enjoyed doing, a part of the book that I really enjoyed doing, was the research around my family's immigration story to the United States, and sort of tracing their paths from, coming in as immigrants to New York and making their way out to Cleveland. And I was very moved to start to feel the presence of particularly my great grandparents, who I hadn't really known. They died when I was very young. To sort of see their presence in my life, to see that how they had created this architecture of security and the sort of flourishing here for my grandmother, for my mother, and then also for me, even though I was just an idea when they were putting that framework together. And I hadn't ever really anticipated that I would be able to kind of start to have an appreciation for who they were as people, the sense of the choices that they made that resulted in my own experience of the world, I guess. And so I just like to highlight that as an element of what was really valuable for me in this process, because I think it's something that a lot of people, it's a sort of universal thing of being able to sense the work of preceding generations.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful idea. I think it's very easy to focus on how potentially bad choices can sort of reverberate through generational trauma, but it's really important, as you mentioned, to think about these positive choices and these positive twists of fate. I think you often talk about in the book that built that architecture or security. So yeah, that's a really beautiful idea. I also wanted to briefly touch on this sort of myth of Ellis Island. There's something that I thought about a lot in the book as a descendant of Eastern European Jewish immigrants, is that it's a kind of a one-shot thing. It was unidirectional. It was, you go to Ellis Island, you don't look back. But often this wasn't the case. Could you speak a bit about the Ellis Island myth?
Yeah, I mean, I had that idea too. Like, I was just like, oh, people come through. It's a one-way street. They never go back. But in my family, that was certainly not the case. That people saw the United States as a place that they would come to and just work for a year, 2, 3, maybe 5 years, and then they would go back to wherever they came, and they would use the proceeds of that work to fund, property purchases, basically. And my great grandfather had done that, and that was the plan for my great grandfather. He was just going to come to the United States and work temporarily. He left in the fall of 1929. And he basically arrived just as the stock market was crashing and the Great Depression was starting. And so his expectations were totally upended about what would be possible. And it was really formative. It was so it changed the course of my family's history that he didn't end up going back, because he ended up having to stay because the financial crisis just wore on, and he needed to be able to make some money to send back. And he ended up being here. So he ended up staying, 10 years, much longer than he anticipated. And he ended up being here when World War II started and was never able to go back, basically. But it was because he was here and had become a citizen that he was able to get his wife, my great grandmother, and his daughter, my grandmother, out of the Soviet Union in the late 1960s, which was very, very difficult to do. And my great grandparents' story is just so fascinating to me, because my great grandfather and my great grandmother were separated for more than 30 years. I think it was 32 years. They hadn't seen each other. He left in 1929 and she arrived in 1961 in the United States. And it's just mind-boggling to think about what that separation must have been like for them, how they maintained that tie over all of that time, that he felt so responsible for her. It's really a beautiful legacy, I think.
I think if nothing else, this book is certainly a story of the best laid plans. But the book is called Ukraine is Not Dead Yet, A Family Story of Exile and Return. Megan Buskey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk about it with me.
Thank you for having me.
The Lawfare podcast is produced in cooperation with the Brookings Institution. You can get ad-free versions of this and other Lawfare podcasts by becoming a Lawfare material supporter at patreon.com/Lawfare. You'll also get access to special events and other content available only to our supporters. Please rate and review us wherever you get your podcasts. Look out for other shows, including Rational Security, Chatter, Allies, and The Aftermath, our latest Lawfare Presents podcast series on the government's response to January 6th. Check out our written work at lawfareblog.com. The podcast is edited by Jen Patia-Howell, and your audio engineer this episode was Noah Mosband of Goat Rodeo. Our music is performed by Sophia Yan. As always, thanks for listening.